702.
The Big Interview
With Bongani Bingwa.
16 after 7, on to this now. South Africa has no shortage of headlines around corruption, poor governance, collapsing institutions. And at the heart of it, I have said repeatedly, is a crisis of leadership. This past weekend, efforts began to prepare for the national dialogue, and the idea was to bring leaders across various sectors of society, from civil society, from government, from labor, from the unions, to come together to talk about the problems confronting us. But many South Africans on the streets will tell you, we know our problems all too well. The issue is not perhaps even the solutions that we lack, but the people who have the willingness, who have the stomach, the gumption to implement them. We've invited somebody who is one of the most powerful voices in this society, renowned businessman, Professor Bonang Mohale, who's of course also the Chancellor of the University of Free State. I could spend the next 10 minutes talking about the many hats you wear, but I think you're well known enough in South Africa for us to get this conversation started. Firstly, thank you for coming into the studio.
Bongani, thank you for having me.
Let's be blunt. Have we run out of leaders in South Africa? Ethical leaders?
We are challenged at the very least and in trouble at the most. Imagine for a moment what 700 million can buy you in South Africa today, in this country, when so many of us dare to hope that joy and peace will prevail. 700 million will totally eliminate the 141 pit toilets that we have not succeeded in eliminating despite the 3 deadlines that we've missed. It can hire all the 800 doctors that have qualified in the province of Gauteng, but we can't hire them because we don't have money. Because you see, if you steal money, it gets finished. 700 million could have educated the 298 councillors in KwaZulu-Natal alone who are illiterate but are overseeing a budget for service delivery.
Why 700 million?
Because that's how much was budgeted just to talk about all the problems that we already know, well articulated, the solutions of which are already known. And you ask the question, do we need ethical leadership? Maybe let me start with the end in mind. Ethical leadership, not in and of itself. Ethical leadership so that it helps us to root out and defeat state capture. You and I know now that we are witnessing the last grab. Number 2, so that also there is transformation, because that's what our forebears died for, so that this economy looks like us. Because if it's not broadly reflective of the demographics, then it's not sustainable. And therefore, business can never be seen, perceived as a national asset.
I see a tension between a society in which there are many people on the margins who feel that it doesn't reward them, that it doesn't give them opportunities, and therefore anything goes because they don't have a dog in the fight, as it were, right? But whatever one's reasons, the more we allow people to damage the society, my argument goes, the more that society excludes people at the margins and only rewards those at the top. So it's a bit of an irony. How do we resolve it?
In fact, isn't it amazing that some blacks, when confronted with a system that subjugates, oppresses, and excludes them, instead of annihilating, destroying the system, they would rather improve their own personal conditions in that system. So when we say we need ethical leadership, it's because ethics is what happens when nobody's watching. When we say we need good governance, it's because good governance has both handrails and guardrails. It prevents you from stealing from the mouths of young children, the sick and the dying.
I'll give you 2 examples. You mentioned the issue of the pit toilets. I remember interviewing a former Minister of Water and Sanitation who on this show said in 6 months we will eradicate them at all schools. We're not on my watch, she declared very boldly. Off the record, I spoke to a certain comrade who said, is she insane? How would those people who now have the tenders to dispose of the waste, right? What will happen to those businesses? Yesterday, I told the example earlier in the show where I stopped a water truck. Well, I didn't stop them. I just recorded them. And they were just dumping liters and liters of water on a suburban street. And he made some flimsy excuse as to why he was doing it. And of course, it was clear he wanted to get back to go and fetch more water so they can invoice more water. But what really shocked me was a group of youngsters who were watching my exchange with the fellow and were upset with me for pointing it out. So it feels to me that we say the fish rots from the head. Well, now that rot is reaching the tail and that whole body has been corrupted. At what point is this irreversible?
In fact, we are not teetering towards a failing state. We are already a failed state. And when
That's a
the
strong
wound,
way to put it.
Yes, when the wound and the pain is inflicted by our own on our own, it is much deeper and much more painful. It is 31 years into democracy, and yet poverty has a complexion and a gender. And that gender is feminine, and that complexion is black. It's 31 into democracy, and yet we are the only country in Africa that ever became free from colonialism. After 30 years, have voluntarily handed over power to our colonizers, oppressors, and racists. We are the only country ever to be free from colonialism.
Explain that. How have we handed over that power?
You know, it's called a constitutional democracy because the constitution is very clear about how you conduct elections and subsequently how you constitute government. The electorate on the 29th of May were very clear and categoric who they voted for. 64% of those, it's the ANC, divided amongst three, 40% ANC, 15% MK, and just less than 10% EFF. And who do we, of all the choices that we could possibly make, we look the other way and say, no, we'd rather go into bed with the DA, which itself is a merger between two white parties in 2000 against the Swart Gevaar of Thabo Mbeki to go on to become the biggest opposition in this country. And yet when black people want to come together and say we need to continue to achieve just the two things, improving the quality of lives of the majority of our people on the one hand, and a better life for all on the other, not just for elected officials. We are told that that's a doomsday coalition. A doomsday coalition for who?
Are you saying that the government of national unity, as it's currently constituted with the DA and the ANC as the two big parties, was not something that was in the best interest of South Africa?
How could it be? Because the last 30 years, the only people who made money in the freedom on whose behalf this was obtained is the Jewish people, the Afrikaners, and the Muslim people, because they've got capital. And you and I have been plunged into a self-perpetuating vicious circle of abject poverty. And let's dare not call it the GNU, because we know that it is a coalition with the DA. But to try and give it a fig leaf, we then decided that, we need to invoke the spirit of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's government of national unity. And we signed even the agreement that was prepared by the DA, including all the three contentious clauses. The first has to do with this notion of proportionality in the election of the executives. Number two, it talks about sufficient consensus in breaking the deadlock. Lastly, it says, how are we going, who's going to have the right of veto in inviting other political parties so that, again, we dare not call it what it is, a coalition with the DA beyond just the ANC, the DA,
All right.
and the IFP.
Let me put this to you. There have been conversations now about BEE, for example. Someone like Professor William Gumede has argued about the monies that have been really available only to the select few, the politically connected. Some might say the issue or the problem that we face isn't necessarily to be blamed on minority groups who have clearly scored because the opportunity was there, but because our entire architecture of this economy and its structure hasn't changed, and to the degree that it has, it's only allowed a few in, and that's been the fault of those who've been in charge.
You have hit the nail on the head, Bongani. You see, we were warned that if we don't handle our freedom well, the colonizers, oppressors, and racists will come back as investors. They'll give themselves a name called the market, and they'll oppress us forever. Today, unfortunately, we're witnessing exactly that. Because you see, the slave master doesn't have to lynch, rape, whip, and kill us anymore. He has succeeded in teaching us to be able to do it all by our very self. And that's what we are continuing to do. And that structure of the economy, the reason why it was given to the Afrikaners, it was primarily for three reasons. Number one, South Africa must continue to provide and be a crucible of cheap labor forever. We haven't changed that. Number two, that we can go to the belly of the earth and dig for this gold, and they will have their first right of refusal. Lastly, even if we find a few diamonds, they will determine the price, hence the creation of the London Sales Organization. That system that has ensured that it is impossible for black people just to make ends meet. How can you even save as an African in South Africa today when 70% of your monthly wages or salary goes to transport and food?
What's the solution?
I think the solution is to continue to reclaiming our streets and realizing that this country that our forebears died for really has not achieved its freedom. Zapu's Joshua Nkomo says something that came late to me is the fact that it is possible for a country to attain its political liberation without its people being free. Even the first president of the ANC to be the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Chief Albert Lutuli, says you don't want even your most fiercest enemy at their weakest to exclude you as a solution. At what stage did we decide that MK and EFF are our worst enemy than the DA? That itself is a measure of two white parties, Tony Leon's Democratic Party, DP, and the NNP. And yet we can't do the same today without being labeled.
Let me ask you this. You've been chair of many a business in South Africa. You've been an executive at many of the businesses in South Africa. What was the most difficult ethical decision you ever had to make?
The first is to make business realize that because it employs 16.5 million people, when government in all three tiers, 2.3 million at that time, now 1.3 million, that if business is transformed, the whole of South Africa will be transformed. That was the most difficult, because up until today, if business had realized that transformation is manifestly in their own interest, business will be much more broadly reflective of the demographics. Business would have instituted gender equality and gender pay parity. Business would be run by more women than men because of the 65 million South Africans. 52.5% of them are female, and yet their representation in positions of leadership is less than 24%. African women, less than 4%. Business cannot be defended until and unless the people in Alexander can see the tangible benefits.
Professor Bonang Mohale, always a pleasure to speak to you. Prof will be at the Legacy Leadership Summit on Friday, the 14th of November. This is at the Henley Business School in Johannesburg. And amongst the other voices, there'll be Professor Thuli Madonsela, Dr. Alistair Mokoena, and that panel discussion that's going to try to get to the core of ethical and authentic leadership. You can go to Legacy Summit _ZA on socials to find out more. That event is hosted by Transform 360, Appleton Consulting, and Business Accounting.
Current events, developing stories,
Tough questions.
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.